Did Elvis Presley ever sell out his rock and roll roots? Was the king of rock and roll sometimes more focused on commercial success than artistic integrity? Number 7. Wooden Heart, 1960. Remember when Elvis was drafted into the U.S. Army and shipped off to Germany? That 2-year military stint changed him in ways fans couldn't have predicted. While stationed in Germany, Elvis recorded Wooden Heart, a sugary sweet tune partially sung in German for his film G.I. Blues. The song featured Elvis singing lyrics like Muss I denn zum Stadel hinaus, alongside English verses about a wooden heart. Critics at the time were shocked. This was Elvis Presley, the hip-swiveling bad boy who had parents across America clutching their pearls just a few years earlier. Now he was singing a cutesy folk song with German lyrics. It felt like a calculated move to win over international audiences and soften his image for more conservative viewers. Wooden Heart never appeared on the U.S. singles charts during Elvis's lifetime, but it became a massive pound, one hit in the UK. Record executives seemed to understand that American rock and roll fans weren't ready to see their rebellious icon singing this kind of material. Music journalists describe it as evidence that Elvis was being transformed from a rock and roll pioneer into a mainstream entertainer designed to appeal to the widest possible audience. The song represented a stark departure from the raw energy of tracks like Hound Dog and Jailhouse Rock. Some critics viewed it as the beginning of Elvis's artistic compromise, a pattern that would continue throughout the 1960s. Elvis biographer Peter Grulnick later wrote that songs like Wooden Heart showed how Colonel Tom Parker's influence had begun steering Elvis towards safer, more commercial territory. Elvis never performed Wooden Heart in concert after returning from the Army, perhaps understanding that the song didn't represent his authentic musical voice. While fans in Germany embraced the track as a sign of respect for their culture, American rock purists saw it as evidence that the once dangerous Elvis was being sin-hide for mass consumption. Number 6. Bossa Nova Baby, 1963. What happens when you take a rock and roll icon and force him to chase passing fads? By 1963, Elvis was firmly entrenched in his movie career, churning out formulaic films with equally formulaic soundtracks. Bossa Nova Baby, featured in his film Fun in Acapulco, caught the bossa nova craze that was sweeping America at the time. The song's title alone telegraphed its commercial intent to capitalize on a popular musical trend rather than build on Elvis's own musical legacy. Critics noted that Elvis seemed to be following trends rather than setting them, a complete reversal from his revolutionary early career. Music journalist Grail Marcus later wrote that songs like Bossa Nova Baby represented Elvis at his most calculated and cynical, merely a vessel for whatever musical fad might sell tickets. The once authentic voice of youth rebellion was now chasing musical trends like bossa nova that had little connection to his roots in blues country and early rock and roll. The recording itself is polished and professional, with Elvis delivering an energetic performance. But many critics felt the song lacked any genuine connection to Elvis's musical identity. It was simply a product designed to capitalize on a passing trend, with Elvis's name and voice attached to increase sales. Elvis used to be the one everyone copied, wrote one prominent music critic at the time. Now he's the one doing the copying. While the song reached pound 8 on the Billboard Hot 100, it represented for many the artistic compromises Elvis was making to maintain his commercial appeal. The original version of Bossa Nova Baby had actually been recorded by Tippy and the Clovers as a much rawer R&B track. Elvis's version smoothed out the rough edges and packaged it for mainstream consumption, a pattern that critics increasingly noted in his 1960s output. Even Elvis himself seemed uncomfortable with this direction. In private conversations recorded years later, he expressed frustration with many of his movie songs, feeling they didn't represent his true artistic voice. Bossa Nova Baby stands as a prime example of Elvis being molded to fit commercial trends rather than following his own musical instincts. Number 5. Do the Clam, 1965. Can a song title alone signal a sell-out? By the mid-1960s, Elvis was trapped in a cycle of making 3 movies per year, each requiring soundtrack, songs that often served merely as background for on-screen action. Do the Clam, from the film Girl Happy, represented what many critics considered the absolute nadir of Elvis's artistic output. The song was written specifically to accompany a beach dance sequence in the film. With lyrics like, do the clam, grab your barefoot baby by the hand, it seemed designed solely to launch a dance craze that could help market the movie. Critics were merciless, with one famously writing, "If this is the king of rock and roll, the crown has slipped to cover his eyes." What made Do the Clam particularly painful for Elvis purists was the timing. While he was recording disposable tracks like this, the Beatles were releasing Help, and Bob Dylan was putting out Highway 61 Revisited. The musical revolution that Elvis had helped start had moved on without him, while he was stuck making novelty dance songs for beach movies. Elvis's longtime band members later revealed that the singer often expressed embarrassment about recording such material. Drummer D.J. Fontana recalled, "Elvis would sometimes joke before these sessions saying, 'Well, boys, let's go make some more soundtrack garbage.'" But under contract to both his film studios and Colonel Parker, Elvis had little creative control. Music historians point to songs like Do the Clam as evidence of how Elvis's management prioritized short-term profits over his long-term artistic legacy. Each film soundtrack sold reliably to his devoted fan base, regardless of quality. But with each release, Elvis's credibility with serious music critics eroded further. The contrast between Do the Clam and Elvis's formidable early catalog couldn't be more stark. The raw emotion of Heartbreak Hotel, the sexual energy of Don't Be Cruel, and the innovation of Mystery Train had established him as a gutting musical figure. Now he was instructing teenagers how to do a made-up dance move in a transparent attempt to start a fad. Despite the critical drubbing, Do the Clam still reached pound 21 on the Billboard charts, proving that Elvis's name could still sell records regardless of the material. But for many music historians, it represents the period when Elvis seemed furthest from his authentic artistic self. Number 4. Old McDonald, 1967. Is there anything less rock and roll than a nursery rhyme? In 1967, while rock music was being revolutionized by psychedelia and social consciousness, Elvis recorded a version of Old McDonald for the film Double Trouble. Even by the standards of Elvis's movie songs, this selection seemed calculated to strip away any remaining edge from his musical persona. The recording features Elvis singing the children's classic with a slight rock arrangement, but the result struck critics as embarrassing rather than charming. Rolling Stone later included it in a retrospective of Elvis's most cringe-worthy moments, noting that even Elvis's powerful voice couldn't make barnyard animal sounds cool. What made this recording particularly jarring was the musical context of 1967. The same year Elvis was singing about farm animals, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Jimi Hendrix delivered Are You Experienced? And the Doors broke through with their revolutionary debut album. The generation gap in popular music had never been more pronounced, and Elvis seemed firmly on the wrong side of it. Elvis confidants later revealed that the singer was well aware of these more progressive musical developments and felt increasingly trapped in his formulaic film career. Marty Lacker, part of Elvis's Memphis Mafia entourage, later wrote, Elvis would listen to these new albums and get depressed. He knew what good music was, but he was stuck recording stuff like Old McDonald instead of the material he really wanted to do. Colonel Tom Parker defended such choices, arguing that Elvis's broad appeal depended on maintaining a family-friendly image. "We're selling Elvis to everybody, not just the long hairs and the hippies," Parker reportedly said when questioned about song selections like this. But music journalists weren't buying it. One famous review at the time simply stated, "From the man who once sent parents into a panic with his pelvic thrusts, we now get nursery rhymes. Rock and roll isn't supposed to grow up and become safe." While Elvis would eventually break free from this artistic rut with his famous 1968 comeback special songs like Old MacDonald, represent what many consider his commercial lowest point, recordings made purely to fulfill contractual obligations with seemingly no concern for artistic integrity. Number 3. There's no room to rumba in a sports car. 1963. Can a song title be so bad it damages a career? Elvis's film career produced many forgettable tracks, but There's No Room to Rumba in a Sports Car, from the movie Fun in Acapulco, holds a special place in the pantheon of songs that critics consider evidence of Elvis's artistic compromise. The song's premise is exactly what the title suggests: a novelty tune about the impracticality of dancing in a small vehicle. With lyrics like, "There's no room to rumba in a sports car, you can't twist or even do the cha-cha-cha," the song represented everything critics felt was wrong with Elvis's movie period. It was silly, disposable, and seemed designed solely to fill 2 minutes of screen time, rather than add anything meaningful to Elvis's musical legacy. Music journalists of the era pointed to songs like this as evidence that Elvis had become a corporate product rather than an artist. A prominent critic wrote at the time, "Elvis now records songs not because they speak to him or his audience, but because they fit a scene in a movie script written by someone who's never been to a rock and roll show." The recording is particularly painful for Elvis fans because of what was happening in the singer's career at the time. By 1963, Elvis hadn't performed live in several years, focusing exclusively on movie work. His album releases consisted primarily of soundtrack collections rather than cohesive studio efforts. Meanwhile, new acts, inspired by Elvis's earlier work, were pushing music forward, while he seemed stuck in a creative holding pattern. Elvis's guitarist Scotty Moore, who had played on Elvis's revolutionary early recordings but was largely absent from his movie sessions, later commented, "Those movie songs weren't what Elvis was about. He knew it, we knew it, but the machine kept churning them out." What makes There's No Room to Rumba in a Sports Car particularly emblematic of Elvis's sellout period is that the song doesn't even attempt to connect with the qualities that had made him a ground-breaking artist. Gone was the fusion of country, blues, and gospel that had created rock and roll. In its place was a novelty song that could have been recorded by any studio vocalist. Colonel Parker famously said, "We're not in the music business, we're in the Elvis Presley business." Songs like this seemed to confirm that selling Elvis as a brand had become more important than developing him as an artist. Number 2. Yoga is as Yoga does, 1967. How far could Elvis stray from his rock and roll roots? By 1967, Elvis's movie soundtracks had reached peak absurdity with Yoga is as Yoga does, a novelty song from Easy Come, Easy Go. The track featured Elvis singing about yoga poses with lyrics like, "Yoga is as yoga does. It gives you such a glow, it's good for your body and it's good for your soul." Music journalists were unmerciful in their assessment. One prominent critic wrote, "It's difficult to imagine anything further from the dangerous, hip-swiveling Elvis of 1956 than this sonnet-eyed Vegas entertainer singing about yoga poses." The song seemed deliberately designed to be as non-threatening as possible, stripping Elvis of any remaining countercultural credibility. What made Yoga is as Yoga does particularly painful for long-time Elvis fans was the context. The song was released at the height of the 1960s counterculture movement, when authentic interest in Eastern spirituality was growing among young Americans. Rather than engaging with this cultural shift in a meaningful way, Elvis's song treated yoga as a silly punchline. Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had a well-documented strategy of keeping Elvis in the mainstream, avoiding controversy that might limit his commercial appeal. Songs like Yoga is as Yoga does represented this philosophy, taking to its extreme, scrubbing away anything distinctive or challenging about Elvis's musical personality in favor of broad, inoffensive entertainment. Studio musicians who worked on these sessions later revealed that Elvis often seemed disengaged during the recording of such material. Backup singer Kathy Westmoreland recalled, "You could see the light go out in his eyes when he had to record some of these movie songs. He'd do his professional best, but his heart wasn't in it." The contrast between Yoga is as Yoga does and the groundbreaking music being made by Elvis's contemporaries and disciples in 1967 couldn't have been more stark. While the Doors were recording Light My Fire and Aretha Franklin was releasing Respect, Elvis was lending his voice to disposable novelty tunes. Music historian Peter Gurulnik noted that this period represented the nadir of Elvis's artistic expression, when commercial considerations completely overwhelmed musical ones. Songs like Yoga is as Yoga does weren't just artistically questionable. They actively damaged Elvis's musical legacy and made his eventual comeback more difficult. Number 1. Song of the Shrimp, 1962. Can one song capture everything wrong with an artist's career? Trajectory. For many Elvis critics and historians, Song of the Shrimp, from the film Girls, 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 represents the ultimate example of how far the king of rock and roll had fallen from his revolutionary beginnings. The song features Elvis narrating the life and death of a shrimp, sung from the shrimp's perspective. With lyrics like, "I'm just a little shrimp who's never done no harm, a swimmin' in the water so peaceful and calm," the song struck critics as perhaps the most absurd material ever recorded by a once ground-reigning artist. Music journalist Lester Bangs later wrote that Song of the Shrimp represented the complete neutering of rock and roll's most dangerous voice. The contrast between this novelty tune and Elvis's earlier work like That's All Right, Mama, or Jailhouse Rock could not have been more dramatic. The man who had scandalized America with his hip movements was now singing a childish song about crustaceans. What makes Song of the Shrimp, particularly significant in Elvis's catalog, is how it exemplifies the commercial forces that had reshaped his career. Colonel Parker and the film studios had determined that the most profitable version of Elvis was one that appealed to the broadest possible audience, including children and conservative parents who might have been alienated by his earlier, more sexually charged performances. Elvis's friend and Memphis Mafia member Jerry Schilling later revealed that Elvis would sometimes mock these songs in private. He'd put on this exaggerated voice and say, "Look what they've got me singing now," Schilling recalled. He knew these songs weren't good, but he was trapped in these movie contracts. The recording also demonstrated how far Elvis had moved from his musical influences. His early work had been deeply rooted in African-American rhythm and blues, country music, and gospel authentic American art forms with deep cultural significance. Song of the Shrimp had no connection to these traditions. It was purely a commercial product designed to fill screen time. What makes the situation even more tragic in retrospect is that 1962, the year Song of the Shrimp was released, was also when the Beatles were beginning their recording career and Bob Dylan was emerging as a major voice in American music. While these artists were pushing popular music forward, Elvis seemed to be moving backward into increasingly childish material. For many critics and music historians, Song of the Shrimp represents the lowest point of Elvis's artistic compromise, the moment when the revolutionary had completely surrendered to commercial forces. It would take his famous 1968 comeback special to begin repairing the damage done by songs like this. Did Elvis ever fully recover his artistic credibility after recording songs like these? And does his later comeback make these artistic missteps more understandable or even more tragic in retrospect?